Okay, so we are welcoming attendees. At the moment, people are joining. So welcome everyone to this section. So I'm Alessandro Pavan. I'm chairing the section. I have the honor of chairing this amazing section on platforms, broadly meant. So for those who are just joining, the format is 30 minutes per paper, 15 minutes to the presenter, 10 minutes to the discussant, and 5 minutes for general Q&A at the very end. Please don't interrupt neither the speaker nor the discussant during the time that has been allocated to them. Just collect your questions and ask them at the very end. You can either ask the question using the chat, or you just unmute yourself at the very end and ask the question. Okay, with no further delay, let's get started. Our first speaker is Steve Tadelis. So Steve is going to talk about price salience and product choice.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. Thank you, Pinar, for agreeing to discuss this, and thanks everyone who is joining. The ways in which different levels of salience of information affects consumers or decision makers is something that has received attention, at least for about 15 years, if not a little more, in behavioral economics. And now there's more interest coming from the regulatory side, in particular vis-a-vis consumer protection. And one area that has received very pointed attention here is the use of what people call in the industry drip pricing or price obfuscation online, where mandatory fees, this is not like shipping, handling, and different ways in which you could get it faster or slower, but rather just a fee that is levied by the sites, and they're only disclosed at checkout after people make their choice and are ready to pay. And here are just three examples from the last couple of years. The Canadian Competition Bureau sued Ticketmaster a couple of years ago. They ended up settling, and Ticketmaster changed their practices. In March 2018, the UK's Advertising Standard Authority imposed pricing transparency requirements to try to alleviate this kind of behavior. And about a year and a half ago, the Federal Trade Commission had a workshop on online ticket pricing in marketplaces like StubHub, the one that you're going to learn a little more about here, that one of the issues was, again, the issue of price obfuscation. And there have been earlier studies, like I said, around behavioral economics. Probably the most well-known is this study by Chetty, Looney, and Croft, where they manipulated whether people saw the taxes of goods in the supermarket on the shelves compared to the norm, where we only get the added taxes at the checkout. And what people have established, including Chetty, Looney, and Croft and other studies, is that when prices are obfuscated, in other words, the taxes or the fees appear later, people are more likely to purchase items. And that, of course, measures the extensive margin. What we'd like to do is go a step beyond that and not only measure the extensive margin, but also the intensive margin of what is it that people choose to buy. And if one wants to take seriously the idea that people are harmed by this kind of behavior, then both are needed to measure consumer harm. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into the theoretical predictions of any standard model that has the elements where people are naive about these fees. If they're shown up front, then people see all the correct prices up front and therefore could make, quote unquote, the right choice, versus if they are shrouded and they only appear at the end, then people will pick things that are not their optimal choices. And then there's some assumption that puts a friction in re-optimization in all these models, which we also use. And basically this results in two predictions. First of all, what we've already seen in other studies is the quantity effect. When prices are shrouded, consumers will be more likely to purchase. And the issue is that by shrouding the fees, it makes tickets seem cheaper. So I just want you to think of, say, a 15% fee. And then if you don't see them up front, everything looks 15% cheaper. so that if you're a consumer for which the cheapest goods would still be too expensive if you knew the fees, then without the fees, they look cheap enough to buy, and then you get slapped at the end with the fee, and you're like, well, I'm stuck with this. This could either be some kind of reference point or switching costs. We're agnostic about where that friction comes from. The more interesting and innovative part of this paper is the second effect, which we call the quality upgrade effect. And that is that when the prices are shrouded, right, when those 15% fees come at the end, then consumers who would have bought a ticket if the fees were not shrouded are now going to buy a more expensive and higher quality ticket. And again, the idea is that if you have a percentage fee, then the drop in prices become even bigger in absolute value for more expensive tickets. And that drives consumers to buy the more expensive tickets. So these are the results that we're going to take to the data. And the data we have is from StubHub, which is the largest secondary market for tickets. And it used to be owned by eBay. When we did the study recently, eBay sold StubHub, even though I think there's some things that are tied up a bit in the antitrust courts in the UK. StubHub guarantees transactions, so we feel pretty comfortable ignoring issues of quality and fulfillment and so on. And like I said, there's a fee structure, which is a 15% fee for sellers. And of course, sellers know that because that's part of the contract when they list their tickets. And then buyers have a 15 to 70% convenience and delivery fee. And historically, all the sites used to have these as back-end fees, as shrouded. So you didn't see the fees until you reached checkout. And then in 2013, actually the beginning of 2014, StubHub switched the whole site so that everything, all the fees were upfront and there were no bad surprises. That followed an experiment that we did the year before that showed that that would actually harm the company. I'm not going to talk about that experiment. It's part of the paper, but it's pretty much a secondary part that adds some robustness. What we're looking at here is in 2015, when they thought of switching back to back-end fees, we ran an experiment where we randomized whether the fees are shown upfront, so you see everything as the status quo was, or whether they're thrown at the back so that you get a surprise of those fees at checkout. In terms of the journey of the consumer, and I'll show you in some pictures what that looks like, you first choose a venue that you want to go to. So if you're, I'm sure many of you are familiar with StubHub. There's also SeatGeek, and Ticketmaster has a secondary market. This is just a secondary marketplace for event tickets, music, sports, theater, etc. So initially you get a seat map, which shows you where the tickets are. Then you could select a ticket and you see the ticket details. Then you do the review and submit, and that's where you go to checkout. And the difference between the treatment and control is that the control, if you will, because that was the status quo, all the fees are upfront. So from the seat map, the prices are going to be the same all through until the transaction. Whereas the treatment, the seat map will have tickets that don't show the fees. So everything is going to look to be about 15 to 70% cheaper. Same on ticket details, and only on review and submit will you get slapped with the fee. So basically, this is what you look at. You know, you're going to choose an event. You see this is what the event page looks like, and you see all these tickets here. You're going to select a ticket. This, by the way, is the control feature because it says no surprise fees. In the treatment, this does not appear. And then when you select a treatment to check out, it doesn't matter where you come from, you're going to have the same final price. But if you're in the upfront fees, which is the status quo or the control, this is going to be the price that you saw from the get-go. Whereas if you're in the back-end fees, which is treatment, you're going to see a cheaper price, and only later will you get slapped with that extra fee. So what is the empirical strategy that we're using here? It's quite straightforward since we have a randomized experiment of millions of users. And this is another advantage of this study, is that we have a very large sample size. Unfortunately, because of StubHub legal, there are certain things that we can't say, including how many people were involved here, but we're talking about millions. The study ran for 10 days in August 2015. And just think of the quantity effect very simply as the treatment effect on an indicator of whether or not you bought or not, okay? And what we are going to report is beta over alpha here, which is the percent change in purchases for back-end fee users. In other words, those who get surprised by the fees, what is the increased percentage in the likelihood that they will purchase? Again, the reason is we cannot report total quantities because StubHub viewed that as a business secret. In terms of the quality upgrade effect, people buying higher quality, more expensive tickets, well, this is what we would like to measure exactly. This would be the expected price paid for an individual who would buy a ticket when all the prices are revealed. So this is control. So the treatment is 0. And they would have bought a ticket under the control and as well as the treatment. And we only want to know the difference in the price for someone who would have bought anyway. Okay, that would be the exact measure of the quality upgrade effect. Unfortunately, we don't observe people who would have bought under control and then also bought under treatment because you're either in treatment or control. So we can't quite measure the exact change in what would have happened to someone who would have bought anyway. And the reason is we only observe people who buy under treatment and people who buy under control. And of course, people who buy under treatment are a combination of those who would have bought under control and are also buying under treatment, but also some people who would not buy under control because all tickets are too expensive and now they're buying under treatment. So that's that extensive margin that would make it, it kind of contaminates our ability to exactly measure the quality upgrade effect. However, we could put bounds on that because these consumers that are added to the purchase because suddenly prices are cheaper, you could think of them as marginal consumers, consumers with relatively low willingness to pay. We could take advantage of that too, and I'm not going to go through the details here. If you're curious, you could go to the paper. We're able to create a lower bound and an upper bound on these quality upgrade effects. So with that in mind, let me tell you what the effects are. The likelihood of purchasing when fees are shrouded, in other words, where you only see them at the end, it's a 14.1% higher probability of purchasing tickets, and conditional on purchasing, people buy tickets that are about 5.5% more expensive. So here we see the quantity effect, and here we see the lower bound on the quality upgrade effect. Just to put these in proportions, I'm going to go to the actual numbers here. If you think of the change in revenue as a combination of the change in price for tickets that would have been bought anyway, that's the quality upgrade effect, and the change in quantity at the same price, think of that at that extensive margin, then you get that of the change in revenue, close to 20% is what we get, of which about 28% is the quality upgrade effect. And that's on the lower bound. On the upper bound, it's even larger than the extensive margin quantity effect. So this just shows that taking what we have from previous studies, which is very well documented, is a sizable, but definitely maybe not even the total amount of this consumer harm that I mentioned earlier. Now, in the roughly 3 minutes, 4 minutes that I have here, let me show you a few other things. This is the quality upgrade effect shown in a completely different way. Clearly, rows A, B, C, these are the front rows of a venue, are higher quality than later rows. We see an increase in the propensity of buying these high quality seats relative to things that are nearby. Again, it seems like everything is shifting upward towards higher quality tickets. Another thing that we document in the paper is looking at the purchase funnel. So remember, there's the event page, then you select a ticket, then you review and submit, and then you purchase. Well, if you think about the fact that if people see all the correct final prices up front, that's when you'd be less likely to move from the event page to ticket details because tickets are too expensive. And we see this. Your 23% is the likelihood of moving from the event page to the ticket page if you see all the fees up front. It's closer to 28% if the fees are not up front. So there's an increase in the likelihood. And similarly, you see the opposite at the back end, right? At the end of the funnel. So after you see the tickets, there's no surprise at the purchase for people who had the tickets up front. A third of them buy, 2/3 of people just end up never buying. And only 18.5% end up purchasing when they do get that bad surprise. So it's almost half of the difference that you see there. Another thing that's interesting, you see this is the number of tickets that are viewed. What you see here in the gray is the people who don't get any surprises. So about 84% only view one ticket. People with the back-end fees that they get a surprise, fewer view only one ticket, but I must say that I was surprised that it's still about 75%. So not a lot of re-optimization, even when you get slapped in the face, you just kind of, exit, so to speak. This is, again, something about different levels of experience. People with more experience on the site seem to be less influenced by this bad surprise than people that have low experience or are completely new users. These are very, very similar. So it seems that with experience, people understand that there are fees, but still, it's not perfect. Another thing that we took advantage of is the fact that right after our experiment on September 1, StubHub switched the whole site back to back-end fees in order to get people to buy more and spend more money. So what we did is we basically said, okay, we have the experiment, treatment versus control. And then 2 weeks later, the control was treated. So we could look at kind of the lag treatment effects to see to what extent we see learning. And this is just the technicalities of this idea of whether the salience effects are short-lived or long-lived. And at least from the analysis that we have, this is the difference between treatment and control before the experiment. Here's the experiment, you see it very clearly. And then after the experiment, if we had a symmetric approach so that everybody who was treated now fully understands that there are fees, and now the controls are fooled, then the way you see this dot up here, you should have seen a similar symmetric dot down here. We don't quite see it. There is a little bit of downward pressure here, borderline significant. So it seems that there is some learning, but it doesn't seem to be very strong. Of course, in the long run, learning may be stronger, but we just don't have that kind of data. And the last thing I want to show you before wrapping up is that sellers seem to respond rationally to what's going on. What you see here in dark blue is the listings of rows A to E. Those are those high quality rows. And then you see F to J and K to O and so on. And you see that after the launch of the full site, there seems to be a permanent uptick in sellers listing rows that are higher quality rows compared to before this change happened, which again is commensurate with some other studies like Ellison and Ellison in electronic sales online. So to very quickly conclude, regulators do have a reason for concern, and price salience does matter for the effect on whether you buy, which was well established, but also on what you buy, which is what this paper is able to flesh out. It seems that salience is persistent and stronger for new and infrequent users. And it does seem like it's a story of information processing costs. I will end there and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Steve. So the discussant is Pinar Yildirim. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for giving me the chance to read and discuss this paper by some of my favorite people, Steve and Sarah. I thought the paper was very incompetently done. At the same time, it had some ideas that were appealing to our common sense and provoked some ideas that were somehow unexpected as well. I really applaud the authors for doing many, many small exercises that were trying to answer a number of questions. Now, these days, they have 2 minutes to go to StubHub, but if you were to go to StubHub, this is what you would see. On the left-hand side, you see a bunch of prices of tickets with different qualities. On the right-hand side, you are given the option to filter these prices. At the same time, you're also given an option to see if you would like to see the overall prices with the estimated fees. Now, this wasn't always the case. Going back a couple of years ago, as Steve mentioned, the default option in StubHub was actually seeing all the prices, price tickets, prices with the estimated fees included. Now, the question is there a benefit to showing the consumers the actual ticket prices, or is there a benefit to showing the overall prices? And this is what this paper is trying to do. It's trying to understand the returns to the pricing, disclosing service fees at a later stage compared to the prices, and runs a large-scale field experiment on StubHub to be able to estimate these numbers roughly. Now, this is roughly what the experiment is looking like. If you were going to StubHub before the experiment, you would be, as a consumer, simply seeing the overall prices, the prices that are inclusive of the fees. And this is the upfront pricing scheme. And at that point, you could either leave or you could simply go out to checkout and simply have the ticket. In 2015, there's an experiment that's run for over 10 days. At this period, roughly 50% of the users are assigned to a backend fee condition. And in this case, there are 2 changes that are happening. As you go in, you start seeing a presumably lower ticket price. And then at that point, of course, you could be choosing to leave. And then in the second stage, you see some fees. And at this point, you could either go back and re-optimize your search, or you could be leaving, or you could be checking out. And what's unique about this paper, how this paper is differentiated from the existing papers, is simply this idea that there might be a change in the extensive margin because of the presumably lower prices. There might be more users buying tickets, but at the same time, there might be some individuals who might be upgrading to potentially better tickets, and that's the intensive margin. I think another maybe characteristic of this paper that hasn't been mentioned much by Steve in the presentation is this idea that consumers get to potentially re-optimize their search, and they can answer whether consumers do this, or they can at least have data to be able to answer this question. And this is what, as he showed, this is basically the comparison of the upfront fees and backend fees. Now, what do they find? Interestingly, what they're finding is almost no negative outcomes from the perspective of StubHub. Once they run this experiment, they find that there's a positive effect from the perspective of StubHub, both at the extensive and the intensive margin. Even within the same cookie session, there's about a 12% additional likelihood of a consumer buying a ticket. And when they buy on average higher prices, and they actually leave higher levels of revenue. Now, what was less settling in these results were 2 things in some sense. When we look at the 12-month churn rate of the consumers who has been exposed to backend fees, they're less likely to churn, about 3% less. And in fact, if you were to look at some of the long-term effects, say, for instance, the propensity to purchase within 10 days, these effects, the elasticity is even larger compared to the same session effect. So it's suggesting that potentially there's no long-term negative effect. And those were some of the things that I wanted to discuss. What's surprising, I'm going to focus on 3 things. First of all, the backend fee consumers, in theory, the ones who should be re-optimizing, they're not going back and re-optimizing enough. Second, it seems like based on the results, there's no long-term harm or no evidence of learning of the consumer, which I thought was hard to wrap my mind around. And finally, of course, seller's response, which should be taking a little more closely into account. Now, going back at this idea of re-optimization, when a consumer starts a search, presumably a consumer looking at a ticket with a price of a quality of Q, price of P, and an appreciation of the quality of theta, this consumer under the upfront fee condition will be purchasing if simply the valuation is greater than 0. But assuming under the backend fee condition, the consumer gets a chance to re-optimize this decision, and there's a cost to searching, the consumer should be expected, at least a proportion of the consumers should be expected to buy at lower fees, and at the same time should be less likely to buy. Now, this there is probably, presumably, a proportion of consumers who do this, who engage in this, but this is not really mentioned within the paper. We don't really hear about these consumers. In fact, the negative effects from these consumers are dominated by the positive effects of consumers who are misinformed, who simply ignore or maybe pay less attention to will be fees. They don't go back and they don't re-optimize. And when we look at the ratio or proportion of consumers who tend to engage in multiple listings, we see that it's fairly low. As Steve also mentioned, there's fairly little re-optimization. And I couldn't wrap my mind around it. Given the chance to re-optimize, why wouldn't I want to do that? I thought maybe there are some unique characteristics of StubHub that might actually contribute to that. And if that's the case, maybe we cannot generalize the results from StubHub to other cases. One thing that comes to mind, especially for ticket websites, is this idea that there's a ticking clock, right? You cannot go back and recomplete a search, do a search without risking to lose your ticket. And on top of that, of course, the more desired an event, the higher are the prices, and the higher is the risk of losing your ticket. So I wonder to what extent the fact that you cannot simply go back and search without keeping your existing ticket would be a contributor to this idea of you don't re-optimize, you don't go back and re-optimize your choice. A second thing, the fairly low negative effects, long-term effects. When we look at the purchase funnel, we see that consumers indeed in the backend fee condition, there's a big dropout from the initial stage to the last stage, as expected. But at the same time, there's very little churn. And how do we put these two things together? That the consumer is smart enough to understand that backend fees are not great and they are willing to quit in the session, but at the same time, in the long term, they're not interested in quitting. I couldn't put those two things together. And the authors are doing a few exercises to be able to discuss these long-term effects or limited learning to demonstrate that there is limited learning. Two exercises in particular they carry out the main specification using, this time, looking at different experience levels of users. But one thing which is, I think, less convincing is the fact that experienced users are defined based on their prior exposure to the site, as opposed to the exposure during the experiment. So in some sense, I found the fact that highly experienced users are less likely to be exposed to salience effects counter to my intuition, because these users are very used to seeing upfront fees, right? They should be the ones to simply show us, they should be the ones to be more mistaken compared to everyone else. Second, in another exercise, looking at basically post-September 2015, this is when the website is switching completely to backend fees, looking at the spending between the users who were treated versus not, and showing that there doesn't seem to be a difference. So here too, I thought that the results might be suffering from some kind of selection bias, because the users who continue to use StubHub into September 2015 and so on, these users might simply be the ones who have not been so much exposed to the backend fees, who are not very negatively impacted by the backend fees. Perhaps they don't have outside options to buy tickets. Perhaps they are the higher income group. Is it fair to compare these groups and to simply argue that there's no difference, to conclude that there are no long-term effects? This is something else that I would like to bring up. The two-sided market nature of StubHub, which is something that authors are well recognizing. I wanted to bring this up in the calculation of quantity effect as well as the quality upgrade effect, because I did not think that the calculations were adjusted for the two-sided market nature of this platform, where sellers, as the authors show, are adjusting prices as well as the quality after the experiment. So that's something else. And one final thing before I close. Consumers, of course, there's also a discussion in the paper about consideration sets, which I think is great. But there might be additional features that affect consumers' consideration sets once the prices are affected. For instance, the filters on the front page. If I start, for instance, if my highest willingness to pay is $300, in the back fee condition versus the upfront fee condition, I will see a fairly limited number of tickets or different type of tickets, right? The set that is given to me or shown to me is going to look different depending on how the filtering functions work. Does that affect the consideration set or the information? And I will stop right there. Okay, thank you.
Thanks to you, Pinar. Let me
All
also
right,
point to
let me.
one question of it that was in the Q&A by Tomasz Sadzik. Steve, you can read it directly from the chat, probably it's more efficient.
Yeah,
so let's
I could read it. How do
yeah.
the effects on sales of shrouding 15% of the price compare to the effects of transparently dropping the price by 15%? In other words, to what extent are people confused? Well, we don't have any experimentation on the actual listing prices because we don't have any control for that. That's something that is selected by the sellers, Tomasz. So I can't directly answer that question. I will just say a couple of things for Pinar. Thank you, Pinar, for a very thoughtful and careful discussion. Several of the things you were surprised, like the churn result. Trust me, we were equally surprised. The lack of reoptimization, you're right, we don't make a big deal of this in the paper, but like I mentioned, this is something that did surprise us, that there's so little reoptimization. Now, if I try to rationalize that, not that easy. For the churn, I might just see that one story is, well, people decide, okay, I'm not going to use StubHub. Now I go to SeatGeek, and guess what? Same kind of thing happens to me. Now I go to this other site, same thing happens to me. I guess I might as well go back to StubHub. They're not any worse than anything else. And just, you know, as a broad comment, when StubHub made this change to all-in pricing in 2014, here was their belief. Back-end fees, meaning surprising people, is something that must make people angry. Let's switch the site. People initially are going to shy away from buying from us because everything's going to look expensive, but then they'll figure out that we're the nice guys and we're going to gain all this market share. Never happened, okay? So am I going to stop studying economics because people seem to behave in really weird ways? No, but there are these weird ways that seem to be pretty prevalent. One thing to mention about the experience versus less experience, again, very important point that you raise, because indeed these experienced people in the last 2 years, they saw back-end fees. I would guess, but we can't confirm this because we only have data from StubHub. People who are more experienced mean that these are people who are more interested in venues. They probably are also people who visit other sites more frequently to look at the competition. And therefore, they're probably more aware that fees are part and parcel of what's going on here. Again, there's no way I could test that specific mechanism, but it would rationalize these choices. Sarah, I see you're there. Do you want to add anything?
I only just that we thought about the selection issues that you mentioned, Pinar, with trying to look at how effects persist over time. We wish they'd allowed us to run the experiment longer, because that would have allowed us to, to take that out of the equation. But thanks for the comments. It was really terrific.
Well, thanks to both Steve, Sarah, and Pinar for this excellent presentation and discussion. Let's move to the next paper. So Jidong Zhu from Yale. So please share your screen when ready. All right, so Jidong will present joint work with Mark Armstrong on consumer information and the limits to competition. Again, 15 minutes and then 10 minutes to be discussed and 5 minutes at the end for Q&A.
Thank you very much for attending this session. Actually, Mark was supposed to present this paper, but due to some time conflict, I'm doing this on behalf of him. Okay. So in many markets, firms supply differentiated products and they compete in prices. And in this type of situation, the market performance crucially depends on how much information consumers have about those competing products. You can imagine a situation where you go to a city, you need to book a hotel. For example, there are 2 hotels there. If you know very little information about the 2 hotels, suppose both of them are 4 stars, so there's no vertical quality differentiation. If there's very little information, you cannot tell which hotel fit your need better. So in that case, the match quality between the consumer and the product is poor, but that will induce a very fierce price competition among the two hotels. But if more information is available to the consumer, they will be more able to find the better match the hotel. But in that case, each hotel will have a higher market power because they know that only consumers who really like a particular hotel will book that one, right? So this very broad trade-off between match quality and price competition is kind of known. But in the literature, there's very little systematic investigation of how the amount of information consumers have will affect the degree of competition and the market performance. So in this paper, we are trying to answer the following 4 questions. Is more information always associated with more market power of firms? Can biased information provision, which will favor one firm over the other, help relax competition among firms? And in which direction is the broader trade-off I mentioned before optimally resolved for consumers? And more generally, the main question we want to answer is, what's the optimal information provision if we want to maximize firm profit or if we want to maximize consumer welfare? Okay, so that's the main question we are going to answer. And of course, we believe the results of this paper can be applied to a few situations. Perhaps the leading application is about the information environment design of some platforms. For example, like Amazon or Expedia, lots of firms, competing firms, sell products there. Consumers try to gather information on the website and to choose which product to buy. And if the platform want to maximize the industry profit, then what will be the best way to provide information to consumers? If the platform want to maximize the consumer welfare, and what's the best information design, and so on. Of course, what's the objective of the platform depends on lots of the things, which we're not going to discuss in this paper, because this paper we're not going to explicitly model the platform, but you can keep this background story in your mind. Other applications, including like information transparency regulation in certain industries, or when buyers can commit to how much information to acquire. Okay? The model. Suppose there's a risk-neutral consumer who wants to buy one of 2 differentiated products. Let's assume the outside option is irrelevant. In the paper, we discuss a sufficient condition for this assumption to be true, and we also discuss a case when the outside option becomes relevant. So if there's no outside option, then for the consumer, only her relative preferences, which is the difference between the variations for the 2 products, matters for the consumer's choice. And we normalize the range of this relative preference to -1 to 1. And in this talk, we just assume in the beginning, the consumer's prior belief is that, oh, my relative preference x tilde is uniformly distributed between -1 and 1. But before purchase, the consumer will observe a private signal S. And this signal is generated by some public signal structure, the sigma function. So this sigma function is a mapping between the consumer's true preference and the signal she is going to receive. And this is a general way to represent the consumer's information environment. After seeing the signal, the consumer is going to update her belief about her relative preference x tilde. But because the consumer is risk neutral, so only the expected preference, this we denoted the x, matters for the consumer choice. And these 2 products are supplied by 2 firms, and they each choose a single price and they compete in a Bertrand-Nash fashion. And the firms know the signal structure sigma, okay, because this signal structure is public, but they don't observe the signal realization of the consumer. Okay? So they cannot do any price discrimination. That's why they charge a single price. Okay? And here we assume price information is transparent. Of course, in many situations, firms also, or the platform may be also able to manipulate the price information, like Steve's paper mentioned. Okay, but here we're just going to assume price information is transparent. Only the product information can be designed. Okay? And our question is, what signal structure sigma is going to maximize the industry profit or consumer surplus? And a big restriction in this paper is we are going to focus on the signal structure, which will induce a pure schedule pricing equilibrium. Because for some signal structure, we will only have a mixed schedule equilibrium, but the mixed schedule equilibrium with product differentiation in general is very hard to deal with. In the paper, of course, we also discussed like to what extent we can make some progress when we allow more general signal structure, which can induce mixed schedule pricing equilibrium. Okay? But now let's just assume pure strategy. Okay? So basically this paper, you can, because here we don't have an explicit designer of the sigma, so you can regard the whole paper as a comparative static analysis with respect to the information structure. Okay? So let me give you a couple of examples. The first one, full disclosure. So in that case, the signal is just reveals the true preference. Okay? So this is like the standard Hotari model. Consumers are uniformly distributed online between -1 and 1. It's very easy to solve. The equilibrium price is 1. Okay? With full market coverage, because there's no outside options at the moment, the industry profit is also 1. And then what's a consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is this. Here, the mu is the expected variation for a random product. And this expectation term is additional match efficiency from a perfect match and minus the price consumers are paying. So this is a consumer surplus. Okay? Another very extreme case, if no information at all. Okay? In that case, consumer will, because the expected X is just a 0, the consumer will regard the two products as identical. So we will have the standard Botryonic competition. Price will be equal to 0. Here we normalize the production cost to 0. So industry profit is 0. Consumer surplus is just a mu, the expected variation for a random product. So the match quality is very poor here, but consumers are also paying the lowest possible price. So it turns out the consumer surplus actually is higher than under full disclosure. So this example is suggesting that the price effect actually dominates the match quality effect here. Okay? And a slightly more complicated example. So here, with a probability theta, the consumer will perfectly observe the true preference X tilde. With the rest of the probability, the consumer will only learn whether product 1 is a better match or product 2 is a better match. So basically, you only learn the rank of the two products. So that's why we call the truth or rank signal structure. In this case, especially in the later case, when you only learn the rank, your expected X is just a binary distribution. Okay? And when this probability theta is not too small, in this situation, we still have a pure strategy pricing equilibrium where price equals 1 over theta. So now you see the equilibrium price or industry profit now is bigger than 1. 1 is the profit under full disclosure, right? So this information structure improves firm profit compared to full disclosure, could be 30% higher. But this information structure does not lead to any mismatch because consumer will always be able to figure out the better match the product. Okay, so there's no efficiency loss. So this example is suggesting that one way to soften price competition is to provide a cost information to reduce the number of near indifferent consumers. And from these 3 examples, we can see that full disclosure is optimal neither for firms nor for consumers. And giving full disclosure is not optimal for firms, so more information does not always imply more market power of firms. Yeah. Now let's go to the general case. Let G be the distribution of the expected X. Okay, so we will call G the posterior distribution. And it is very well known in the information design literature that the posterior G must have been mean preserving contraction of the price distribution. And any G, which is a mean preserving contraction of the price distribution, can be generated by some signal structure sigma. Therefore, we can look for the optimal posterior distribution G instead of the signal structure directly, subjected to the mean preserving contraction constraint. So that will simplify the problem. Okay? How to solve the problem? Of course, I will not tell you all the details. Okay? So basically, we will go through 2 steps. The first step is what G, if we don't think about the information design problem, so if there's no MPC constraint, what G can support a pair of target price P1 and P2 as equilibrium prices. So this question is totally independent of the information design problem. And then we will study what prices, together with their supporting G, are optimal for firms or consumers subject to the mean preserving contraction. Okay. So for the first step is basically answered by this lemma. So we show that a distribution G can support a pair of prices P1 and P2 as the equilibrium prices if and only if the G distribution is between two bounds, a low bound and an upper bound. And both bounds only depends on the price you want to implement. This is an if and only if result. Of course, not all pair of prices can be equilibrium prices. And we also show that P1 and P2 can be equilibrium prices only if and only if they satisfy this condition. So let me just, before the lemma, the other lemma, let me just give you a graph to show the first lemma. So here, these are the two bounds for the G to implement a symmetric pair of prices half. So as long as G is between these two bounds, it must be able to implement this as the equilibrium price. Okay, so when you want to implement different prices, those bounds will change. Okay, and all possible equilibrium, pure strategy equilibrium prices in this range. Okay, so that's lemma 1. And the lemma 2 just to tell you that any asymmetric G will be always dominated by some symmetric G, no matter for firms or consumers, which means asymmetric information provision will never be optimal. Okay, so we can focus on symmetric information structure or symmetric G. So by using these two lemmas, we can derive the main result. So I just tell you the result. I still have 2 minutes. Okay, so 1 minute for each result. The firm optimal posterior G will have this kind of U-shaped density function. So the red one is a price distribution density, the uniform, and the firm optimal posterior is U-shaped, which means we try to reduce the number of consumers around 0 because those consumers are very price sensitive. So you want to try to reduce the number of those consumers, but you cannot push down this point too low because you have to satisfy the mean preserving contraction constraint. So this is the maximum way you can do. Okay, reduce the consumer in the middle, push them to the two extremes. And at the optimal, the profit can be improved by 63% compared to full disclosure. And under the firm optimal design, total welfare will also be maximized. Okay. And the consumer optimal design, the consumer optimal posterior density will look like this. It's very peaked around 0 to intensify price competition. But you can also see there's two small segments there, which means those very choosy consumers with strong preferences, they will be informed enough to buy their preferred product. But other less choosy consumers, they will be giving very little information so that they will feel almost indifferent between the two firms. That will intensify price competition. So in other words, here we are sacrificing the welfare of those less choosy consumers to improve the welfare of those consumers with stronger preferences. Of course, you may say, oh, this is very close to no information disclosure. It's true for two firms, but what about if we have many firms? When we have many firms, if you don't give any information at all, the match efficiency loss will be huge. But the counterpart of no disclosure to the case with more firms is you just tell consumer the top 2 products. That's enough to induce price equal to a marginal cost. But at the same time, consumer can get one of the top 2, which is not too bad compared to top 1 if there's many firms there. Okay, so at top 2, signal structure will be close to be consumer optimal when we have many firms. Okay, I will skip the literature. Here's just the main message of the paper. And if you go to the paper, you will see we do other things. For example, we derive the welfare frontier when we can flexibly design the information. We can introduce variant outside information, allowing mixed strategy or more firms. But in those extensions, the problem is not fully solved. It's technically pretty challenging. So we only make the limited progress. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jidong. So discussant is Hannah Laburda. So Hannah, please share your screen.
Okay. Can you see it? Well,
Perfect. Thank you.
thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss this paper and, you know, making me read it carefully right now and not in a year or so. It is a very interesting paper. It brings, it actually lays groundwork for information design for platforms. And this is why it is so interesting for me, actually more than I ever expected. So the paper tackles a well-known problem of a trade-off between match quality and price. So very often when we get better information, customers get better information, they can choose a product that matches better their preferences. It seems like a good deal. It seems like something that would improve their utility, and it improves their consumption utility. But at the same time, it allows the firms to charge higher price. So the net utility may actually not be higher for the platforms, and on net they may not be higher for the customers, and they on net may be worse off. So platforms are all about matching and about customers and products. So the issue of this trade-off between match quality and price is very common. There are many examples. One of my favorite examples is targeted advertising. So without any information about the potential customers to whom advertisers advertise, advertising is cheap because it's not very effective. As they get more information, advertising gets more effective. At the same time, it gets more expensive. And very often, there are many arguments made that targeted advertising makes only the advertising platform better off and not really the advertisers who are customers in this case. Of course, the trade-off doesn't always go in one way. So sometimes when you bring together competition and more information and better comparison, as the platforms do on the internet, we may see that prices may decrease, and in other cases, the prices may increase. So this paper is very important because it looks at this question of the trade-off, which point and what information structure is optimal for customers and firms in a competitive environment. And looking at this problem in a competitive environment this is what makes it novel about this paper, because there are other earlier papers that look at the trade-off but without the competition. And this is also what makes it applicable for platforms. So as Dijong mentioned, this is a paper that is that the results of the paper would apply to how platforms should design their information structure. So what they find, they have several very interesting findings. And first, they show that full information is not optimal. Full information is too much, and it is neither good for customers nor for firms. So I found that it's not good for customers pretty straightforward, maybe because we had all those arguments about targeted advertising and other examples, because the price increases too much and it outweighs the benefit of increased match quality. But I was more surprised about the fact that it's not good enough for firms, because I would think initially, and it may be kind of interesting why it's not true, that full information would give the highest price that firms can charge. It turns out that what Dijong and Mark are showing is that there exist signal structures that are better for customers, and they allow different signal structures that allow to charge even higher prices than the prices under full information, and these are better for the firms. So for the customers, the optimal signal structure would match very well the customers who have very strong preferences. They have very high X in the model, but it requires a mismatch for consumers who have not such strong preferences, whose X is closer to 0. And this mismatch allows for lower prices. So this is what I call a grumpy equilibrium, because a big chunk of mismatched customers, they are very grumpy about their being mismatched, and they think that with better information, they would have a better match and they would be better off. But really, they wouldn't be better off because we know that in equilibrium, then the price would outweigh the benefits. For firms, they can charge even more, but under different information structure. So if you tell some of the customers you will truthfully reveal their preferences, but for other customers, you will only tell them which of the products is good for them, but not by how much. It turns out that it increases differentiation, even with respect to the full information, and it allows to sustain higher prices than in full information, which I found pretty interesting. So very cool results and interesting findings, but it made me, it left me wondering, how can a platform really use these findings in real life? So first, the results rely very much on very specific signal structures. And I couldn't really find good examples of how those signal structures can relate to the tools that platforms could really use. So for example, would it mean that the rating system on the platform should be contracted to just the stars and as little description as possible? Or should there be more dimensions? So it's not just one-dimensional rating system, but like, for example, TripAdvisor is forcing you to evaluate the hotels on at least 4 different dimensions, not just one overall rating. So that especially truth or rank signal, what would be an example of a truth or rank signal in within the tools that platforms have available? Then I was wondering, so I noticed that some results, like for example, the results that consumers are better off with no disclosure than full disclosure, rely on zero cost assumptions. And it is okay to talk about zero cost assumption when we are talking about digital goods. And a lot of platforms do deal with digital goods, but really a lot of comparison platforms are selling goods that are very costly to provide. Once we have significant variable cost, then those results are not so straightforward. And in many cases we would. Second is, it is very important to assume a single price for the result that the full disclosure is suboptimal for firms. If we allow for price discrimination, and if we look at the actual pricing schemes, there are a lot of promotions and discounts and a lot of price discrimination because you have information about users from other sources, then you're not, some of those results are not going to hold. So how, I was wondering how sensitive those results are to kind of real life tools that platforms have available. And finally, the paper is analyzing very carefully what is the optimal information structure for customer surplus and for firms' profits. But the way it argues it positions itself is as a grunt work for this for the information structure for platforms. But it doesn't really talk about what would be the optimal signal structure for platforms. And this is what Dijon mentioned, that it's not the goal in the paper, but I think it would be interesting to discuss if the platform is designing the optimal structure and setting aside the issues with the tools available, it could design any information structure. What would be the optimal information structure? And of course, this could not be independent from asking what would be the platform's pricing scheme. But because if the platform can design both the pricing scheme, of course, if it charges more of the firm side, maybe it is more aligned with firm's profits. If it charges the customers, maybe it's aligned more with increasing customer surplus. But probably the answer would be somewhere in between. So you wouldn't really want, the platform wouldn't really want to just benefit one or the other, especially that we see that those signal structures that are optimal for customers are very different than the signal structure that is optimal for firms. So what would the in-between look like? And going back to the
Anna.
model, yes.
So
I basically have just two questions that I'm not going to elaborate. Is whether the model can tell us more about the entry or purchasing or costly acquisition of the signal. And overall, I think it's a very cool paper that is opening up a wide avenue for future exploration on the topic. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Hannah, for an amazing discussion, and thanks, of course, to Jidong for an excellent paper. So there is one question in the Q&A. Jidong, you may want to read it directly, and then take a couple of minutes to perhaps selectively answer some of the points that Hannah has raised, and or the question in the Q&A.
Good. So the question is asked by Shota. Have you thought of varying not only the consumer's information, but also the seller's information about the consumer's willingness to pay? So basically, this is like a design problem on the other side of the question. Like we can design how much information firms can have about the consumer's preferences. So I think both questions are very interesting. Actually, many people are working on the question Shota is asking at the moment. In that case, basically is you can design information for firms so that firms can do more fine the price discrimination in a competition environment. Okay, so like basically the competition version of the BBM paper in the monopoly case. So lots of people are working on that. So far, some progress has been made, but not an easy question. And we just focus on the other side of the question about the consumer. And Hannah, thank you very much for your discussion. Those are all very good questions. Some, of course, are very challenging. For example, what's the exact way to implement our optimal information structure? Because the purpose of this paper is mainly to give some like welfare limits. If we can arbitrarily design information, what's the limit we can reach? In terms of exactly how to implement those optimal information structure, even technically, like mathematically, it's very hard to deal with. But roughly speaking, for example, like a rank structure, like in my hotel example, if the location of the two hotels will basically determine whether you like hotel A or hotel B, just to tell them location, but nothing else. In that case, you can figure out the rank, but not the exact variation for each hotel. Okay. And another thing is about the optimal design for platform. So that really depends on what's the objective function of the platform. If the platform object is a weighted sum of consumer surplus and industry profit, our welfare frontier result in the paper can help you solve that Ramsey problem. Okay, but again, how to implement the optimal design is still, we don't have a very good idea yet. Okay, in terms of how practically to do that, but it can give you some rough guidance which direction you should go, basically. Okay, that's all. Thank you very much.
Sorry, thanks a lot to both. This was really impressive. Let's move now to the next paper. So Shoshana, please get ready by sharing your screen. So very happy to have Shoshana Wasserman talking about voluntary disclosure and personalized pricing. Floor is yours, 50 minutes as usual. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone. This is a paper. Oh boy, that's not supposed to happen. Let's just do it this way. This is a paper with Najib Ali and Greg Lewis. So I'll just jump into it. I don't have to convince anyone in this crowd that the study of privacy and price discrimination is interesting and current. And it raises a lot of regulatory questions. For example, questions that have been addressed so far in the session. For example, how might firms exploit knowledge of consumer preferences? What happens in equilibrium under different segmentations that result from knowledge? And more generally, is personalized pricing good or bad for consumers? Now, there are a lot of ways to try to address this question. And what we're going to do in this paper is to try to address it in the model of consumer privacy that's based in verifiable disclosure. And verifiable disclosure for us is very related to consumer control. We're going to ask the question of what happens when consumers are able to voluntarily disclose or not disclose their information. And it might make sense to think about privacy in the sense because this is exactly the language that's used oftentimes in policy discussions. For example, here's a screenshot from the GDPR website. And so the way that we're going to approach this problem is to provide a stylized model that could give some intuition for what happens in equilibrium with the many moving parts that are involved with privacy and pricing. We're going to provide a model in which consumers have the ability to provide verifiable information about their preferences, and we're going to say something about our main question. So the question we're going to really focus on is the third one that I mentioned. When consumers can choose, when the consumers have the ability to choose whether or not to verifiably disclose to the market and what to disclose, can they benefit from personalized pricing that results? And the hitch in this question is that disclosure is not a one-sided thing. The absence of disclosure doesn't mean that the firms don't learn anything about you. Rather, in equilibrium, firms will infer information whether or not you actually disclose anything yourself. And the classical intuition from Grossman and Milgram, for example, is that verifiable disclosure just leads to unraveling. Everybody reveals exactly who they are, and generally the conclusion is that not very much of benefit is generated. But let me try to convince you that this is not necessarily the case. And I'll focus on the monopoly example first. Let's think about a very simple classic monopolist pricing problem. We have a single consumer, we'll refer to her as she, to the consumer as she, who has unit demand and some value V for a product. The consumer interacts with a monopolist who has zero marginal cost. The consumer draws V from a random distribution, let's say the uniform distribution over the unit interval 0, 1. The consumer observes V, but that's private to her, and she can. So what happens next? The way that this problem usually works is that the monopolist knows that the consumer will purchase the product only if V is higher than her price, if it's profitable. And so the monopolist, not knowing the consumer's exact type, can think of the distribution or the demand function, the demand for the product as 1 minus P, maximize profits, and get that the optimal price is 1/2. And so the ex interim consumer surplus here is V minus 1/2 if the consumer has a high enough value to buy the product and 0 otherwise. But now let's introduce verifiable disclosure. The way that we're going to model disclosure is as follows. The consumer observes her valuation V drawn from uniform 0, 1, and now she has the ability to send a message that's available to her. And a message is verifiable in the sense that it's got to be truthful. I'll explain in a second what that means more concretely. But she chooses from an available set of messages. The monopolist observes the message, updates his beliefs, and then sets an optimal price P as a function of that message. The consumer then chooses whether or not to buy, and everything progresses in a perfect Bayesian equilibrium. Importantly, though, there's no commitment power. So a consumer who receives a price that she doesn't like does not have to buy it afterwards. She does not pre-commit. And we're going to think about 2 types of technologies for these message spaces. We're going to call message spaces technologies. The first form is simple evidence. The idea here is that consumers basically have 2 options. Either they can fully reveal themselves and send their type V to the monopolist, or fully conceal themselves and basically say nothing at all. To keep things clean, we'll say that corresponds to the message 0, 1. And what verifiable means here is that the consumer can only reveal her true type. She can't lie. There's no cheap talk. And we can think of this as sort of like a track, do not track dichotomy. You either let the seller track you and then they know exactly what your preferences are, or they know nothing at all. And the verifiability is kind of like a certification. We'll also think about a rich evidence structure. And what rich evidence means is that the consumer can disclose an interval that contains her true type. So for example, if the consumer is of type 1/4, she can say I'm between 0 and 1/2, but she can't say that she's between 1/2 and 1. That would be lying. And the one way to think about what the interval structure is giving us here, I'm not going to talk too much about generalization, but the important part of the interval structure here is that it gives us a kind of convexity. Essentially, if types V and V prime have evidence in common, then any type between V and V prime is also able to send that message. Maybe this is helpful. One way to think about the distinction between simple and rich evidence is that they both require you to speak the truth, But in simple evidence, you have to speak the whole truth. You have to reveal everything or say nothing at all. Whereas in the rich evidence structure, you can say anything that is true, essentially. And the question we want to ask is, how does this technology, how do these technologies change what can occur in equilibrium with disclosure? So the first thing I'll do is set up some benchmarks. I'll claim that first of all, unraveling can still happen. There exists a fully separating equilibrium in which every type reveals itself. Why is that true? Essentially, we can do this by construction. Every type reveals itself and gets a payoff of 0, because as soon as the monopolist knows that you're type V, she prices the consumer at exactly V. And deviating doesn't help because the payoff is still 0. You can't really do much better. The firm will still know how to price you. And so there's no incentive for either the consumer or the firm to deviate. There's also a fully pooling equilibrium. This is no disclosure whatsoever, in which every consumer just sends the message 0, 1, basically reveals no information. And based on our monopoly pricing problem from before, we know that the monopolist will charge 1/2. To make this work, we also establish an off-path belief that if the monopolist receives any other message other than 0, 1, he'll believe that the message is sent by the highest possible type, and so give the worst possible price. The consumer has no incentive to deviate, so this is an equilibrium, but this is not a helpful equilibrium. We're just back to our no disclosure case, and so we haven't benefited at all. And so this leads to the question, can consumers do better at all in this setting? And the answer is no. Under simple evidence, every equilibrium that can exist for any V, the ex-interim consumer surplus will not be higher than the no disclosure case at all, which is max of V minus 1/2 if the consumer purchases in 0 otherwise. And this is a pretty general finding. This doesn't really depend on our choice of the uniform distribution or even our particular characterization of the type space here. Track to no track just doesn't seem to help very much in the monopolist problem. But this is not true when we go to the rich evidence structure. And we show that this is not true by constructing an equilibrium. One way to do this is with what we call a greedy algorithm. Essentially, construct an equilibrium such that trade occurs with probability 1 for every consumer type, and such that no consumer type is worse off. And I'll show you how almost all consumer types below 1/2 will be better off. The way this equilibrium works, this greedy algorithm works, it looks like something like a Zeno paradox here. Essentially, I'll show it to you by construction. So here we have our interval 0, 1. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the types between 1/2 and 1, and we're going to pool them all together. Now, it turns out that when the monopolist receives the signal 1/2 to 1, he knows that the consumer is between 1/2 and 1. The optimal price is 1/2, which is the same, you might remember, as the price if the monopolist knew nothing at all. But we can repeat this, because now we have the types between 0 and 1/2 left, and we can split them up again. And if the consumers between 1/4, type 1/4 and 1/2 pool together and send the same message, the optimal monopoly price is again 1/4, and we can iterate. So what's happening here? Let me skip ahead a little bit. What's happening is that given the structure of our problem, the monopolist charges the same price at the bottom end of every interval as he would at the marginal type of that interval. That happens to be 1/2 and 1/4 in our example because we used the uniform distribution. But we basically can repeat this under any distribution and construct this greedy algorithm where we basically set up intervals such that the marginal case is always priced exactly the same as the whole interval. What this does is it generates a Pareto improvement for almost every type. And it's an equilibrium because essentially every type is sending her favorite on-path message with an off-path condition that we can think of as a skeptical belief, basically, that any message that's not allowed that's off-path would be treated with a maximal price. Okay, so what have we gotten here? So basically what we've shown is that under this greedy equilibrium with rich information, we can generate a Pareto improvement. And there's no unraveling. So why isn't there unraveling? Well, the unraveling result uses this condition that typically the sender's payoff is strictly monotone in the belief that's induced in the receiver. And that's not the case here because we have these two types that are priced the same, right? We have the boundary type 1/2 for the bottom of the interval 1/4, who gets the same price as the whole interval above it. And so what this does is it creates an incentive for the extremal types not to unravel, which is not the case in the classical setting. Okay, so just to recap, so with the monopolist, under monopolist pricing, we can already generate some benefits from disclosure if it's rich. I now want to convince you that even with simple information, you can generate some benefits under competition. So to talk about competition, I'll use a fairly stylized example again. I'll think about horizontal differentiation in a hoteling style problem. So suppose we have two firms, firm L at point -1 and firm R at point 1. And we'll have consumers that have a type somewhere along this line. In addition to the price that the consumer has to pay for an item for buying, the consumer also has to pay a transportation cost. So it's the distance between her type L and R if she purchases from R, and her distance between her type L and -1 if she purchases from firm L. The timing works exactly the same as before. The only difference is now the consumer compares her full cost from purchasing from each firm, and we're going to assume that the value for purchasing a product at all is sufficiently high that the consumer will always purchase something. So for simplicity, again, I'm going to assume that L is drawn from a uniform distribution. And in this case, the equilibrium is with no information, if there's no disclosure whatsoever, is that the price at both firms, both firm L and firm R, will price at 2. And so the total cost incurred by a type L is 2 plus the minimum of her transportation cost. But now unraveling is already useful. Just unraveling, even if every type perfectly revealed itself and disclosed exactly where it was located on the line, its price would decrease. And the reason is that as soon as type L reveals itself, the firm that's farther away knows that in equilibrium, that it can never compete at any price higher than 0. And so it will price at 0. And so here type L is close to firm R. And so it will receive a price of 0 from firm L. And firm R will price on the residual demand curve, so to speak. And that's already quite helpful. Essentially what happens is if we look at the middle types here, they're most competitive because they're farthest away from both firms. They're going to get a much lower price. But in fact, every type is better off because the no disclosure price was integrating over this whole space. One way to think about it is that firm L, without any information, was pricing with high weight on the possibility that the consumer was very close by, and it really wasn't worth pricing otherwise. And so so any information is already improving the lot of basically everybody except this very edge case. And we can do better even with simple information. The idea behind this is that we can leverage this idea of the center drawing a price of 0 from the farther firm with an asymmetric signal. Essentially, if you're type L here, you're close to type R. If you fully reveal yourself to firm L knows that you are far away and will set you a price of 0. And so how can you improve on your lot from the full unraveling case? Well, only disclose yourself perfectly to firm R, and to firm L, tell firm L that you're not in the priceable region, and then essentially don't disclose anything to firm R. We show that how you can do this with just 2 signals, just track, do not track. But that's basically the idea. You get a price of 0 from the distant firm, and you get the optimal monopoly price from the closer firm. And that's already quite a bit better for the consumers that are at the extremal types. Can we do even better? Yes, we can basically repeat our greedy construction and take the inner types that were happy unraveling or happy fully disclosing themselves, and give them a little bit extra, the same way that we had in the monopoly case, to get essentially a Pareto improvement for every possible type, for every type. And this is relative to both full unraveling and no disclosure whatsoever. Okay, so I've kind of rushed through this, but I've kept to 15 minutes. Rather than going through my discussion, I want to turn to the discussion slides of Gonzalo, since he's not here, and I'll use those to summarize the paper, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so let me slow down now that I'm on the discussion slides. What does this paper do? The basic question that the paper asks is whether voluntary disclosure can help consumers if the information provided is used to price discriminate. And the answer is maybe. It depends on whether you're looking at a monopolist problem or a competitive problem, and it depends on what technologies you have available to use. What we show is that disclosure can be useful. Rich technologies, the rich disclosure technology in particular, can be helpful even in the monopolist case. But we do need partial disclosure. We can't get away with just track, do not track. But when there's competition, even simple disclosure can be sufficient to amplify competition. As soon as a firm that's competitive knows that there's competition for you, it will reduce its price. And that's a very general fact. But we show how this can be improved upon with richer technology structures as well, richer messaging structures as well. And an insight here is that, at least in our stylist example, we can show how exactly we can generate benefits for consumers by structuring essentially pools such that nobody is worse off. We construct these pools in an intelligent way in a greedy algorithm such that the marginal type is always always the boundary case for everybody below that. We call these xenopartitions. And both of these insights are fairly general. I've presented everything in terms of the uniform distribution, but the result that market competitiveness matters is general. The result that partial disclosure is necessary for benefits in the monopolist case is general. The only thing that's not general is the optimality of the greedy algorithm that we've shown you, which will be true in some cases, but certainly not all. I'll skip the things to like, but I want to focus on the questions that Gonzalo had. So Gonzalo was thinking, it seems, about how these kinds of intuitions could be brought to real life. So one way to ask this question is, what are verifiable proxies? What does it mean to have verifiable information? The entire talk was in terms of what Najib would call game theoretic science fiction. So we can think about disclosing a type V in and of itself. But maybe we can think about what this translates to in technology space. So one idea is that verification comes just by tracking things, that by observing behaviors directly and inferring information on them, based on them. So this might relate to actually seeing, like in Steve's experiment, whether consumers purchase or don't purchase as a function of their browsing history, as a function of whether they do this reoptimization kind of thing. There's no lying here because your behavior itself is used to draw inferences. And we can think about extrapolating this. He had some examples here. For example, cart abandonment, which is very similar, or just knowing what kind of consumer you have already tells a lot about your value space. Another way to think about this, I'm going to jump ahead, is as something that comes from a data intermediary. And this sort of relates to how we've been thinking about it. Another way that you might think about verification is that the same way that when you post your credit card onto Amazon to buy something, there's a verification process that determines that it's actually your credit card and that it's actually that it's related to a bank account that can be charged. You might think of structures that are created to do a similar thing for type verification. Suppose that you have some sort of online profile that's corroborated by a trusted institution. What does verification mean in that case? Well, you can imagine tools like sliders, for example. In fact, I think we could replicate our results with a message structure that looks a lot more like sliders. You have a couple of different attributes that you can choose intervals on. So, for example, you want to denote what age range you're in or what income range you're in, So you can imagine a tool that lets consumers use that to submit those kinds of messages very directly, in the way that you would have verification is through some centralized server that's trusted, operated by an institution that's credible. That might work. It might be useful. It might even be coming. We might imagine that it might also be burdensome on consumers. And although Gonzalo didn't mention this, I think an interesting question that arises from our paper is how we should think about equilibrium in general. Our paper is structured in the form and in terms of what equilibria are achievable. We know that we can achieve consumer optimal or consumer beneficial equilibria with our messaging structures, but those are not the only equilibria. In fact, we show that we could also have full unraveling, we could also have full disclosure, and we can have lots of things in a continuum of equilibria in between. And so a third way to think about these results is as a design problem. If you are an institution that's trying to build these kinds of tools, one way you can think about generating equilibria, producing equilibria, is by giving a segmented set of options to consumers to guarantee some balance on their welfare from optimal pricing. We haven't done that. That's left for future work, but I think that's an interesting direction to go forward. I think I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, Shoshana. Let me see if there are questions in the audience. I don't see any in the.
I see one.
There's one. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
So I see. So Daniel's asking, would your disclosure equilibrium survive if buyer types did not come from the continuum? Do you mean if they came from a discrete?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how much it hinges on your ability to sort of get successively fine intervals as you drop down the support of the buyer type.
So there are lots of different equilibria. I think the particular construction would be different. So let's take the rich evidence structure, since that's probably the one that you're thinking of. You could definitely do the same greedy algorithm that we had with a discrete type space. You would do the same thing, order them essentially, rank order them from lowest to highest, and go sequentially from the highest, take the biggest group of types, such that the marginal type is indifferent under optimal pricing by the monopolist, and have them send the same message and then iterate. Now, it's not true that if you do that, that will constitute an equilibrium. There will generally be an equilibrium. The question is whether it will be beneficial. We can show that it will be weekly Pareto optimal, weekly Pareto improvement, but it won't necessarily be optimal. And we can find counterexamples in which it won't be optimal, whereas in the uniform example that I showed you, it actually would be. By optimal, I mean maximizing for consumer welfare, ex ante.
So there's also another question that I missed. I apologize for that. So Malik Ahmed asked, I was wondering whether there's another real life example of verifiable disclosure other than track or not track.
That's a good question. There's certainly some ideas. I don't know that they've actually been implemented, but there have been a bunch of proponents for sort of Internet 2.0 who've imagined privacy settings on something like Facebook, where you where you select exactly what information you give to who and to whom. I think there are already features like that exist on like Google, where you have like this complex menu of what you want to share. So for example, share your name, but don't share your age. You can think of that as a type of verifiable disclosure as well. Although I think the complexity and the technologies for these are evolving.
Sorry, another question by Alan briefly. How would a digital platform offering targeted advertising with granular consumer data control settings fit into your model?
So it's worth mentioning, especially since Zhidong's paper was about match value, that there's no match value in this model. It was entirely about a fixed value that existed that the consumer already knew. And so the information was going directly from the consumer to the seller. There was no value created in that exchange. It was just price discrimination. So I'm not entirely sure where targeted advertising could fit into that, other than perhaps that targeted advertising, if you think of as a form of price discrimination, you might think that a consumer revealing some information about their type would perhaps generate better discounts if they were sort of, if they were pooled with enough types that were with lower willingness to pay than they are. So in that sense, I think yes.
Thanks so much, Shoshana, especially given that you had to do with double role of a presenter and discussant. So let's move now to our next and final speaker. Please prepare. So Georgios will prepare his slides. Oh, fantastic, super fast. So we are very happy to have Georgios Petropoulos talking about optimal algorithmic pricing for interruptible goods. Same format, 15 minutes for you, 10 minutes for the discussant, 5 minutes for Q&A. Georgios, I'm not sure it's only me, but I cannot hear you.
No, I forgot to, sorry for this. Let me share again my screen. Okay, so I'm going to present my research, which is actually work in progress. And I have in the beginning to apologize to Daniel because I only sent him, sorry for this, the draft just few days, the updated draft just few days ago. What I'm concerned is about the fact that algorithmic systems can observe market conditions at real time. And that, in fact, can be good news because we can have efficient transactions. However, there are growing concerns about transparency and price discrimination in digital ecosystems. And my motivating example is the infrastructure as a service cloud computing market. The undisputed leader in the past was Amazon, which basically how this market works. We have the vendor, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and other firms that offer virtual machines, which are used by other firms in order to perform some online computations that they are helpful for their operations in the final service market for serving consumers. And cloud computing market is particularly popular, and it is growing fast because it provides a cheap alternative of building infrastructure on premises for firms to store information, perform some computations with some increasing computing power. So it's considered a very popular alternative that has provided many possibilities for these firms, and consequently to the final, the clients of these firms, the consumers. And Amazon, as the leading vendor, had implemented a very interesting pricing options. I mean, for a given virtual machine, you have the option either to go through a posted price mechanism. So you pay per hour, hour is the time unit, a fixed amount, and which is predetermined, and you know it, as long as you want. Otherwise, you have to go to the spot market and you participate in generalized second price auction for getting access to exactly the same virtual machine. And if your bid is above the equilibrium price, you get access to the virtual machine. In principle, you don't bid at each point of time, at each hour. You bid once, you get access. But the equilibrium price for the given virtual machine fluctuates over time. these fluctuations have the following effect. If the equilibrium price goes beyond your bid, you lose access to the virtual machine. So you consume a good over time under the risk of interruption. And with the help of algorithmic systems that they can react to market conditions at real time, the time unit, it's very small. So it's 1 hour for these auctions. And the price fluctuations. And in fact, some past research that scraped data from Amazon has shown that these price fluctuations can be quite significant. If, for example, the posted price for a given set of virtual machines is normalized to 1, the average, then the mean in the spot market for the same set of virtual machine is almost a half, around 0.5. But if you bid around 0.5 to get access to these machines, you still face a significant risk of interruption. And the justification for this price fluctuation in the spot market is that Amazon had a lot of slack capacity before implementing this mechanism. In the beginning, it had only a posted price. Then, because it had a lot of slack capacity, wanted also to allocate to interested clients, but in a way that it is flexible and in a way that fully reflects the market conditions, so that it's the number of units that they are offering in the spot market follow the market conditions and how demand changes. However, clients are only observe the equilibrium price and past price fluctuations, past equilibrium prices. So in this way, they can assess the risk of fluctuation and for their fluctuation to exceed their valuation. They cannot observe directly market conditions. And data science and information systems have pointed out that price fluctuations in the end may not be market driven, but may correspond to either a random hidden reverse price or for the creation of a damaged good with the risk of interruption for price discrimination motives. I have to acknowledge that Amazon recently changed its pricing model. It was using this pricing model for around a decade and went back to posted price. So there is no any risk of interruption involved anymore. However, there are other vendors which use the risk of interruption, like Microsoft, like Google. They have the posted price, but they also have a cheaper, low priority alternative where you face the risk of interruption. So the research question I'm asking in this model is what is the optimal selling mechanism for allocation of such services, when and under which conditions the risk of interruption can be part of it. And with the risk of interruption, you are moving to a stochastic space. So the question then is how this stochastic mechanism compares with deterministic ones, like the optimal deterministic mechanism by Meyerson. And by comparing two, I wish also to investigate some welfare implications. So the model I'm presenting is a starting point, and it will be the main model actually I present. It's a static game with one seller and one buyer. We have the buyers that they have private information about their valuations. The distribution of these valuations is common Newlett's. And the environment is the following. I mean, when I get access to the virtual machine, let's say, I can only derive some value if I consume it for a given time. And this given time is a function of my valuation. And in principle, how much I will consume it is something that cannot be contracted ex ante. We could say that there is some noisy observation around the consumption in the beginning, which prevents to do that. In a static model, that is a necessary condition in order to move and study the mechanism that I will present. If we expand it to a dynamic setting where demand fluctuations are included, then we don't need that. So if I consume over a given time that it is a function of my valuation, then I realize some benefit from trade. And the selling mechanism incorporates an allocation rule X, which is a probability that a type V gets the good. But then at each point of time over this consumption, we have the probabilities lambdas, which basically refer to the probability of continue consuming the good. And to this, we have also a price attached. So the seller's problem is to maximize the expected price from he can get out from the buyer from this trade agreement over the valuations of buyers, taking into account the individual rationality and incentive compatibility constraints, given the benefit R of the buyer, the expected benefit is defined over the whole period because she needs to consume the good over the whole period in order to get value of that. And then without losing the general features, we can then consider a probability lambda that it is the same over time in each period when we want in the maximization problem. So the operator lambda becomes a unique one. And we assume monotone likelihood property. So before I present the optimal solution of this model, let's see how the Myerson allocation will look like. We don't have any risk of interruption. The probability at each point of time to continue consuming the good is 1. However, there is a threshold type Vmi below which types of buyers are excluded. So only buyers above Vmi participate in the trade and consume the good. Now, if we go to the optimal allocation under certain condition over the expected duration B, there are unique thresholds. There is a lower threshold of types above which the buyers always get the good with probability 1. And but the low types above this threshold value get the good with a positive risk of interruption. So we have some stochasticity that emerges in the optimal mechanics for types between the lower threshold VL and another threshold VCR, V critical, which and the risk of interruption within this range of valuation is monotonously increasing in V. So when we hit the V critical, then the uncertainty in the risk of interruption, the stochasticity disappears, and we have a consumption with certainty. And the conditions over the function B to get this optimal mechanics is first of all that I want when I consume for more time, I derive more value out of that. And also there are also some other condition that refers to specific degree of how concave or how convex value the function, the expected duration B can be. In principle, it should not be too concave or not too convex and not too convex. So if we want to compare this optimal mechanism with Myerson, then the first observation is that we have a trade expansion. So there are some types that, while excluded from Myerson, they are participate in trade in under the optimal mechanism. And if we want to compare consumer welfare, so we are talking, the buyer here is a firm, so consumer goes to the buyer side here. Then there are two opposing effects. The one is the trade expansion effect, where it is the extra benefit for the types that are excluded under Myerson. But we have also the negative effect that it is introduced through the risk of interruption. What the risk of interruption effectively does is that it can create a different menus for different types in a way that we achieve some form of price discrimination. Low types, they face greater price discrimination and they pay less. Higher types, they face lower risk of interruption, but they have to pay a risk premium, a higher price for that. And those introduce some losses that should be taken into account. Effectively, we have a cross-subsidization from high types to lower types, which is not perfect because also the seller can extract higher surplus from the high types that participate in the trade. I mean, just to give you an example, if we assume uniform distribution over valuations and a linear expected duration function, then we can get for many values of this for this linear function full trade expansion. So we have trade for all types, but still the benefit of the types that were excluded from Meyerson that they get is very small. And therefore, the consumer surplus under Meyerson dominates the optimal mechanism. Some discussion and further extension. So this analysis can be extended to end buyers with unit demand. When the optimal mechanism is less likely to incorporate stochastic risks, then we can say that when we have restrictive capacity constraints, when the cost of interruption is not so significant, so drastic, and when we have significant outside option, it is less likely to see this price discrimination motives that introduce through the stochasticity. Next step of the project, and I faced some complications, so it took more time than I thought, is to study demand fluctuations. So to open the problem to a more dynamic framework, and also to study the multi-unit case, which is something actually we observe in this ecosystem. We have some core virtual machines that work on the important services for this platform, for these firms, but we also have some peripheral one that have less value. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Georgios, for a very timely presentation. So the discussant is Daniel Vincent. So Daniel, take your time to upload your slides if you want to.
Can you see the screen?
Beautiful, thank you.
Okay, perfect. So I guess a reasonable, safe policy on these discussions is to try to limit your discussion to only things that you know about. And since I know absolutely nothing about cloud computing and a little bit about price discrimination, I'm going to focus my discussion on that. And really, I want to talk primarily about some of the mathematical structure of Georgios's model here. This is at its heart, and in terms of its theoretical contribution, basically a paper on optimal nonlinear pricing, or what used to be called second-degree price discrimination. What's going on here is the introduction of a slightly different type of buyer preferences, say compared to the classic Meyerson model, that allows a different type of instrument to screen out privately informed agents in an optimal fashion for the mechanism designer. And that instrument is this lambda, which is a Poisson parameter that determines the probability of not disrupting the service. So the way I usually think about looking at endogenous screening problems is to think about the mechanism space and preferences defined over the mechanism space. Georgios's mechanism is a threefold object. It's an X, which is, it's an X, which is a probability of acquiring the service. I'm sorry, my computer just blanked out. X, which is the probability of acquiring the service, lambda, which is the probability of continuation of the service, and P, which is the price for the service. The agents preferences are a little bit more sophisticated. So I've written out the preferences of an agent who has a private information of type V here. So the explicit functional form is this one here, where V is the private information of the buyer. BV is expected time, which is a random variable, that the consumer needs the service. And in Georgia's model, it's usually thought of as monotone in V. Lambda is the probability the service is not disrupted. X is the probability the service is provided. Now, you can actually simplify this model by getting rid of the X and just think about what's going on here in this particular version of preferences. And once you take a look at it here, you can see why, to some extent, I think Georgia's focus on the Meyerson mechanism is a little bit distracting, not so useful. So really, all of the important innovation comes in the introduction of the preference, the way that private information of the agent enters preferences there in that exponential term on the Poisson parameter. And once you look at it this way, of course, if B of V was a constant, then this would collapse to the standard Meyerson model. And then we could apply all of our standard techniques for solving the Meyerson model. The fact that B of V is not a constant depends non-trivially on V is what makes these preferences much, much more rich, and therefore it yields a much more interesting opportunity for screening on the part of the mechanism designer than happens in the standard models. I think that's really where one wants to think mostly about how the how the technological or the technical innovation of this paper enters into the literature. And as a result, it really fits more into the literature on optimal nonlinear pricing than in the, say, the bargaining literature with incomplete information, which is the Meyerson model. You think about it in that way, then again, I think it's somewhat, it's probably a false trail to contrast this with the 0-1 type mechanisms that Meyerson has. In Meyerson's structure, where the preferences of the agent are linear in the instrument of the mechanism designer, then the problem collapses effectively to a straightforward linear programming problem. Not always so easy to solve, but relatively well understood in terms of its properties of the solution. Here, this is clearly not going to, the preferences are clearly not linear in the lambda, which is the interesting instrument that the mechanism designer has. And so we shouldn't expect the kind of 0-1 solutions here that we do in the Meyerson mechanism. So, Georgios describes this still as a work in progress. So I guess I would take a little bit of time to suggest how I would think about at least drawing on our experience with these other kinds of solutions to endogenous price discrimination. And predominantly, I would spend a little bit more time focusing on what incentive compatibility implies for the properties of this lambda variable. We know, of course, that with the pure linear model, that monotonicity of the probability of trade is necessary and sufficient for incentive compatibility. It would be nice to know, are there similar kinds of properties on this lambda as a function of the type of the agent that we can use to understand, to get a better understanding what the properties of an optimal mechanism would look like, or at least in terms of what are the feasible mechanisms in this class. One thing that may pose some difficulties is it looks to me like that this preference space doesn't satisfy single crossing, and as a result, we're unlikely going to see, in many types of solution to this, complete separation. So I guess we're probably going to see some types of pooling coming out of this. On the other hand, because this formulation collapses to Meyerson as the B of V function becomes a constant, we could think at least of some properties or some limited characteristics on that B of V function that would allow some nice clean representations of what that probability of what that feasible mechanism would look like. So these are all just really kind of looking at this whole problem from the standpoint of the technical aspects of solving the problem that I would kind of, if I were sort of digging into it, I would like to see some way of approaching to it. And that's all I have to contribute.
Thanks so much, Daniel, for an excellent discussion. We still have 5 minutes and a half before we shut the session down. So the SSA is very strict on how we deal with timing. Georgios, do you want to briefly respond to maybe a selected subset of points raised by Daniel in the remaining amount of time?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to thank Daniel. I think the directions he proposes, I think they make a very good sense for following it, and that is very valuable. Yeah, exactly. I mean, for the Meyerson comparison, it is exactly that. It is this additional property of the duration function is the one that bring us to a new environment, let's say, because indeed it is a different environment than the Meyerson one. So that I found like interesting to elaborate by also underlying the differences between the two. But I take all the comments into account on alternative ways of framing the model, on alternative ways of linking it to the literature, and on specific aspects that I can emphasize and bring some new insights of that. So this is really helpful.
Thanks so much. Other questions? Let me see also in the, sorry, I forgot to check Q&A if there are specific questions that Daniel and George also may need to address. I don't see any, but I already made a mistake before. So if you guys can also double check so that you minimize my embarrassment.
I think we only have the dire warning that doomsday is about to drop.
Okay, thanks. So this time I got it right. So I have a very brief question for Georgios, which is in connection to the optimality of using randomness on the part of the designer. So there's already randomness by nature. So nature controls for how long the buyer needs to use the facility for the buyer to derive a V that defines the buyer's value. But because of the nonlinear structure that Daniel also mentioned, this is a type of problem where most likely you have that the relaxed program has a non-monotone solution. And then when that happens, you may need to randomize to partially relax the fact that the necessary local constraints don't turn out to be globally sufficient. So have you thought about randomizing over the amount of time that you allow each of the buyer to use the facility as a way of relaxing monotonicity?
No, I haven't gone to this direction. No, but I see your point that that could be an alternative way to look at it. I mean, the condition over how much I use the facility seems to be comes actually from it is the condition under which we can have an interior solution in this problem. And we need some form of monotonicity between the valuation and the duration in order to get an interior solution. Yeah, so I could probably incorporate this. I need to think how.
All right. Well, let me then see if there are questions from the attendees, from the audience. So if you have questions, very briefly, unmute yourself and ask the participants. We're going to close the section shortly. Okay, and for the panelists, so we're going to resume on a different meeting. So the one that Georgios has provided us via email. All right, so I guess that this is the end. So once again, let me thank the presenters and the discussants for an excellent section on pricing in digital markets, and take care to everyone.
Thank you. Nice to see you guys.
Thank you, Alessandro. Thank you.